On the 29th of February, 1692, warrants went out for the arrest of 3 women in Salem Village, Massachusetts. Women who had been accused of witchcraft. The next day, 2 men traveled up from Boston to conduct an examination. One of them was John Hathorne, a member of the upper house of the Massachusetts Bay Legislature and an ancestor of the 19th century novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne, author of The Scarlet Letter. One of the women, a West Indian slave called Tituba, confessed. She described the devil, a thing all over hairy, all the face hairy, and a long nose, she said. The 3 women were taken back and committed to the Boston jail. On March 21st, a 4th woman by the name of Martha Corey was arrested. On March 23rd, the 4-year-old daughter of one of the women was sent to jail, where she remained in irons for 9 months. On March 24th, another woman was jailed. At the end of April, an officer was dispatched to Maine to bring back the Reverend George Burroughs, who had recently moved from Salem to a new appointment, but had been accused. He was the former minister of Salem. By May, the jails were overflowing. Eventually, well over 100 were incarcerated. On Friday, June the 2nd, a trial was held, and 8 days later, Bridget Bishop was hanged for witchcraft. On June 29th, 5 women were tried, all found guilty. 3 weeks later, all 5 were hanged. On August the 5th, 6 more were tried and convicted. 5 were hanged on August the 19th. One of them was the Reverend George Burroughs. In September, another 6 were condemned. On the 17th of September, another 9 were condemned. One of them, Giles Corey, would not confess. He was subjected to an established English legal procedure known as pene forte et dure, designed to enforce confession. He was laid out, stones were piled on him to attempt to extract the confession. 2 days later, still silent, he died, pressed to death. Finally, early in October, Increase Mather, president of Harvard College, together with Governor William Phipps, put an end to it, calling a halt to the trials and releasing over 100 who were in jail awaiting trial. Thus came to an end one of the most famous seasons in American history, 9 months of witch hunting, 20 executions, all people innocent of the charges brought, all caught up in a strange hysteria difficult for us to understand today, all victims of crimes which today we have no place for in our legal system. And from our perspective, all caught up in a belief system which includes devils, demons, and a craft which has its origins in literature, in the imaginative mythologies of medieval times and even earlier. Mythologies not understood at the time as such, but believed to be real. So real that here on American soil, evidence was found and believed in and documented sufficient for the condemnation and public execution of 20 citizens of Massachusetts Bay at a place known today as Gallows Hill, just outside Salem, Massachusetts. Residents of Salem are reluctant to point it out, for it stands infamously as a reminder of one of the darkest moments in American life and history. Welcome to English 3350, a survey of American literature before the Civil War. We're in Studio 3 at the M.D. Anderson Library on the main campus of the University of Houston. I'm Barry Wood, and today we're continuing with our survey and specifically looking at these strange happenings in Salem Village, Massachusetts, in the winter and spring and through the summer of 1692. The whole witchcraft phenomenon, whether we talk of centuries of it in Europe or the Salem trials of 1692, is closely related to the concerns of literature. Literature, as we've been at pains to show, is a use of words to create a separate reality. The words themselves derive from our labels in the real world, but in their imaginative use, they generate a separate reality of fictional characters, events which are imaginative, and invented settings. The devil, of course, is perhaps the most famous of those characters. Separate reality leads to a mythology. But as we have also been at pains to show, the beings, events, and settings of such realities may seem so real that they take hold of imagination. When whole cultures come to believe literally in the existence of such realities, we have a mythology. Mythologies, the evidence of the mythologies that survive today, go back a long time, long before any of the major established religions. By historical times, as evidenced in our surviving mythologies, mythologies of the Greeks and the Hebrews and the Northern Europeans, the separate realities of two kinds were extremely well developed. One, positive in nature, idealized places where the gods dwelled, on mountaintops, in the sky. Places which were paradisal, like the Garden of the Hesperides or the Garden of Eden. Places where people hoped to go after death. And often, most often, these were associated with something above us, in the sky, the stars. The other kind of mythologies which were equally well developed were the negative ones. The places that were feared, peopled by creatures that were feared, places where bad spirits dwelled, places full of pain and darkness, places people feared they might go after death, and places where people feared they might get dragged off to at any moment. Often these were projected as below us, beneath us, underground. Such separate realities were believed in implicitly, and yet they were created by words, by the telling of stories around ancient campfires long before any of the written literature we have today came into being. And these, of course, were fueled by human emotions, hopes and fears, desires and abhorrence. We've talked of these places, these mythologies, as about places separate from us, but such separate realities include the realm of time, too. A paradisal time in the distant past or future, a frightening time, often in the future, often projected to the end of the world, a day of judgment, perhaps the final destruction of all things. Such mythologies, of course, do not remain static. They develop, they grow. Too often, when people think about their beliefs that are based on mythology, they think of these as static, as somehow revealed, as there for all time, not very much aware that these things are constantly growing and shifting according to the needs of new ages. Thus, in the Old Testament, the prophets wrote of a terrible doom that might come to an unworthy people. In the New Testament, John of Patmos added to this, adding his own imaginative coloring, and penned the Apocalypse, as it is known in Greek, or the Book of Revelation, as it is known in English. And in this, of course, he updated it from Old Testament times to Roman times, and worked in all kinds of codes and symbols to suggest the destruction of Jerusalem and of the Holy Land by the Romans. Such a work, of course, builds on centuries of belief in a separate reality, but artists inherit these ideas and they build on them and expand them. And so they imaginatively create both new ideals and new horrors. A day of judgment and a heavenly vision is part of the book of Revelation. In later centuries, people picked up on these, adopting such literary creations as truth. Thus, for instance, in Anne Bradstreet's debate between the body and spirit, spirit ends her argument with a vision in the last 15 lines of the poem, and the heavenly city that Spirit speaks of is drawn directly from the literary version created in the book of Revelation in the final chapter of that book, book 22. Michael Wigglesworth, perhaps the other major poet of the 17th century, in 1662 he wrote and published a long work which he called The Day of Doom. 224 stanzas, 8 lines each, 1,792 lines. Clearly, this is a literary work. There's more in here about the Day of Judgment than in any previous account. Where did the extra come from? Out of his imagination. He peoples the thing with creatures. He puts speeches in the mouths of people, and thus the Day of Judgment, a smaller concept, a smaller mythology in earlier works, is here expanded to a record length. It's clearly a literary work, clearly out of the imagination. Perhaps if the Day of Doom had been written in the 1st century, it could very well have been appended to the New Testament. But it wasn't. It was penned 1,700 years later, and so it stands as a separate literary work. But that sort of perspective will help us to understand what, in fact, something like the book of Revelation was. It was a work of literature, and the Bible is an anthology of Hebrew literature. It's that simple. But over the centuries, it comes to be seen as something else. So what Michael Wigglesworth did was take a cluster of ancient and medieval beliefs about the end of the world, some of them biblical, some of them literary from the intervening centuries, and create a version that was far longer than anything else. Here's the fifth stanza. It's a very dramatic poem. If you read the whole thing, it's extremely dramatic. And we are told, the introduction in the anthology points out that Edward Taylor's wife memorized portions of it. Other sources tell us that she memorized the entire poem and could recite it, and did many times. Edward Taylor did not have a copy of this work in his library. The only book of poetry that Edward Taylor had was Anne Bradstreet's. But he didn't need a copy of Michael Wigglesworth's poems, not with Elizabeth Finch, his wife there. She could recite it any time he wanted to hear it. For at midnight brake forth a light which turned the night to day, and speedily an hideous cry did all the world dismay. Sinners awake, their hearts to ache, trembling their loins surpriseth, amazed with fear, but what they hear, each one of them ariseth. They rush from beds with giddy heads, and to their windows run, viewing this light which shines more bright than doth the noonday sun. Straightway appears, they see with tears, the Son of God most dread, who with his train comes on amain to judge both quick and dead. A very dramatic sort of beginning to this, and in the middle of the poem we have this stanza in which the judgment is pronounced. Ye sinful wights and cursed sprites. Sprites are spirits, wights are souls. Ye sinful wights and cursed sprites that work iniquity, depart together from me forever to endless misery. This is Christ from the throne of heaven pronouncing judgment. Your portion take in yonder lake, where fire and brimstone flameth. Suffer the smart which your desert as its due wages claimeth. Now, this is a good example. Yonder lake, the lake at the bottom of hell, that's not in the Bible. That was invented in Dante. If you read the Inferno, you'll come across the lake in the final cantos of Dante's Inferno, written around the year 1300. But you see, by giving it this kind of poetic form and authority, the thing, then poetic devices and inventions of earlier centuries gradually become accepted as truth. By the 17th century, well, it's very likely that very few Puritans, for instance, had read, well, they may have read Dante, but since he was Catholic, there would be a certain prejudice against reading. But nevertheless, the lore from that work had found its way in. And then we get to the end of the poem. Thus, with great joy and melody to heaven they all ascend. This is the saints, those who are saved. Him there to praise with sweetest lays and hymns that never end, where with long rest they shall be blessed, and naught shall them annoy, where they shall see as seen they be, and whom they love enjoy. Now, in theology, the day of doom is Protestant and Puritan. Catholic theology of confession and forgiveness is not found in this poem. And good works, for instance, is left out because, as we know, the Protestant Reformation did away with good works as a way to salvation. In this way, you can see that a literary work takes shape in its era, in its period, drawing on the accepted theology and carefully screening out theology that's not accepted. Yet, the readers of this poem, the 17th century readers of this poem, read it as a kind of revelation of the truth. And it, of course, is a Puritan poem full of the the harsh Puritan doctrines of the sovereign God, of the depraved sinner, and of the judgment that would come down that would separate the sheep from the goats, and so on. Doctrines, of course, that did not exist before the Reformation. Clearly, then, this is an imaginative recreation of a separate reality that has been in evolution through the centuries. So this poem would not be possible before the Reformation. It's specifically linked to post-Reformation theology and belief. So it's a literary work on the one hand, a new literary work, an imaginative work created by a very imaginative, creative poet. But on the other hand, it becomes part of a developing mythology. And if we can just apply this insight in reverse, we should be able to see then that a work like the book of Revelation, too, is a work of literature. It is updating something earlier than that, applying it to the era of the Roman Empire. And similarly, the prophets who begin this kind of talk of punishment and day of judgment, they too are literary writers working on even earlier materials. There are no final formulations of the way things are. Churches try to create them when they produce creeds, but creeds get thrown out after 2 or 3 centuries and rewritten as people no longer wish to accept certain things. Yet, curiously enough, while these things continue to get revised, in each case, people again and again fall into the notion that the present creed, the present belief, is somehow revealed, especially to them. Well, as we could see, words have a lot to do with this, and this is ultimately true, I think, of the Salem witchcraft trials. We have to really consider the whole idea of separate realities and of words and of literature if we're really going to understand what went on in the Salem witchcraft trials. Now, Salem has had the most attention. People virtually equate witchcraft and Salem Village in Massachusetts. The statistics for that village are that 185 people were accused, 141 were women, 44 were men, 19 were executed. Of those, 14 were women and 5 were men, with a 20th death by pressing for a confession. There is some debate about whether this is an execution or an accidental death in the process of trying to extract a confession. But Salem, though the most prominent of witchcraft outbreaks in New England, is one of 3. The other 2 were in Connecticut. 30 years earlier, down here in Hartford, Connecticut, that is in 1662 and 63, a total of 13 people were accused, leading eventually to executions of 4, 3 women and 1 man. And then the same year as the Salem outbreak, in Fairfield, Connecticut, a total of 7 people were accused of witchcraft. In this case, there were only 2 trials with 1 conviction, and it turned out no executions. But these were outbreaks. Of course, the Salem outbreak was the most dramatic, most concentrated, and involved the largest number of people. But there were, in fact, 3 outbreaks in 3 separate villages, leading to a total of 23 executions. But in addition to these, there were non-outbreak cases of witchcraft in New England. Through the years of the colony, from 1620 to 1725, there were single isolated cases, a case in Boston, a case in another town. In each case, usually there was a trial, a conviction, and then an execution brought an end to it. All in all, there were 150 accusations of witchcraft. 37 of these came to trial. This is outside the 3 outbreaks. 37 of these came to trial. 16 of these came to a conviction, and 12 of these led to an execution. This is in addition to the 3 outbreak cases that I showed you on the map. So in summary, in New England, over 105 years, we have 355 accusations of witchcraft, 103 trials, 52 convictions, and 35 executions. But these 35 pale into numerical insignificance against the European record. In one small area in southwest Germany, for instance, where records survive, a period of 109 years, 3,229 executions for witchcraft occurred, most of these by burning. In the Swiss Confederacy from 1470 to 1700, that is over a period of 233 years, 8,888 people were tried and 5,417 were executed as witches. In England, from 1559, which is the first year into Queen Elizabeth's monarchy, until 1736, which, let me point out, is over 4 decades after the Salem witchcraft trials, almost 1,000 were executed. We have an estimate for Scotland of 4,400, but documentation is limited. Often we have documentation like this for one small district, often to a limited period of time. Records don't necessarily survive. We know from references, sometimes single references to witchcraft trials, that there were numerous ones that never got to the records. One source, Richard Marshall, has said, at the most conservative estimate, 200,000 people in Europe were killed during the witch hunting years. That's over a period of about 3 centuries, from roughly 1500, well, 1400, I suppose, to 1700. Now, the origins of witchcraft are in sorcery, the belief in magical powers. Such beliefs are very widespread. By no means are they confined to Europe. Sorcery is one of many beliefs through Europe, not dislodged by the conversion of Europe to Christianity. Sorcery is also found throughout Asia. A period of 4 years when I lived in Southeast Asia, queried my students, I found that fully 75% of my students could report in their own families an incident of sorcery. And they wrote essays on this. And they gave explanations. They were very good at giving both explanations according to their traditional mythology and explanations according to modern psychology, because these students were, after all, studying to come to the United States and had already had 2 years of university education. But this kind of thing is going on, and there would be write-ups of it in the daily newspaper. How did the church regard it? Tolerantly at first. To put it very simply, the church did not regard witchcraft as a serious threat. Here, for instance, from the Canon Episcopi of the 4th century, gives you a good idea of the tolerance. Some wicked women, it says, perverted by the devil, seduced by illusions, believe they are summoned to evil service on certain nights. Who is there that is not led out of himself in dreams and nocturnal visions? Who is so stupid as to think these things happen? Whoever believes such things loses the faith, and he who has not the right faith in God is not of God, but of him in whom he believes. That is, of the devil. There it is, and that's the end of it. If you are so foolish as to believe in such things as going out of yourself and being a witch in the dark of the night, well, you lose your faith. That's it. But the church said a little more about it. It simply was not a threat. In other words, the church recognized the existence of sorcery, of malefice, which is the doing of evil towards other people, and they recognized fantasies of being in league with the devil, but they went no further than to say that such people should be ejected from the church. 600 years later, in the 11th century, the official position of the church was the same. In the year 1020, the Bishop of Worms drew up a list of punishments for those who practiced sorcery or believed they could practice sorcery. And the punishments consisted of confession and penance. 1 year to 3 years of penance, sometimes simply limited to the special religious holidays. That was it. And so, again, we have to see that the church was not really threatened by this. This was a cultic belief, as far as the church was concerned, left over from early mythologies of Europe, and nothing to be particularly concerned about. Now, demons and witches were generally regarded as bad spirits. Here's a woodcut, for instance, that shows a woman looking in the mirror, and behind her there's a bad spirit. If she were to look very hard up here in the mirror, she would see the reflection of that spirit. But of course she doesn't, because she's so concerned with her own vanity. And she cannot see that vanity is satanic. Witches were all kinds of witches. Sometimes they caused bad weather. Here are some witches performing rites, burning chickens and so on. And you can see in the background bringing down a terrible hailstorm because of this brew. The three witches in Shakespeare's Macbeth are of this kind. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn, and cauldron bubble. Troublemakers, but little more. Witches were also known to make little models or dolls made of wax to harm people. And they were known to like to steal the sacramental materials from the church, the Eucharist bread and wine and the oil and so on. So the church regularly had to deal with this by keeping these things well locked up. But this was a petty theft problem, sort of like making sure your bicycle is locked to a pole, or otherwise it may disappear. It was certainly nothing, really terribly serious. Witches were also, and these spirits were also known to cause impotence in men, barrenness in women. Sometimes female witches would seduce men in the night. These were known as succubi. Sometimes male versions seduced women. These were known as incubus. So witches and demons got attached to things sexual, but still, the church was not concerned. The church advocated confession and prayer. And various 11th and 12th century shysters, of course, they had all kinds of cures too. They advocated herbs, things that you could drink, things that you could rub on your body, things that you could inhale or smoke or eat, which would make you immune from these evil powers, and a long list of herbs and various concoctions. And then there were demons. These were just basically bad spirits. This is a water demon, has a fishy tail. There were fiery demons. They were really too far up in the sky to really concern any of us. There were aerial demons who caused storms. There were forest demons who terrified people in the forests at night. And this is sort of where the fear of forests and wild places comes from in the medieval times. There were underground demons who caused earthquakes and volcanoes, watery demons who caused storms and floods, and night demons. Of course, you could see the connection of these sorts of things with places of the world that were a little feared with emotions. Night demons, of course, if you ever had a nightmare, you may have had a moment when you believed in them yourself. All of these suggest that spiritual belief in animism and polytheism had not really been displaced by the monotheistic idea of one God in Christianity. There were just an awful lot of these creatures hanging around. But still, the church was not concerned. These were folkloristic beliefs that people held left over from earlier mythologies, and the church was not concerned. So what happened? Well, in the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries, the church began to lose its grip. Various developments were seen as threats by the church. Alternate ways of salvation were proposed. For instance, in the year 1176, Peter Waldo began to preach poverty as a way to salvation. And he wasn't the only one. St. Francis of Assisi did too. And he preached without church authority. And the whole idea that poverty could bring salvation was in effect saying you don't need the church to be saved. This sounds strangely like a Reformation, and in fact the movement towards Reformation was occurring 250 years before Martin Luther's time. His followers, Peter Waldo's followers, were known as the Waldenses. They were excommunicated. That was the harshest punishment that the church could think of. Why? Because they rejected the Catholic sacraments, they rejected papal authority, and they rejected the sale of indulgences. So here was the first stirring of reform, except that they didn't suggest reform, they simply rejected what was there and did it their own way. Then, about the same time, in the 12th century, Manichaeism surfaced. Now, Manichaeism was a belief that went back centuries. This belief was that the world was in the grip of two powers, good and evil, who were perpetually doing battle with one another. Now, it was easy for the church to read this as a battle between God and Satan, although Manichaeism developed outside the Christian tradition, but it was easy to apply it to Christianity. And of course, this was regarded as heretical because it made the power of evil equal to God. And in the Christian system, God was absolutely supreme. Satan was no more than a fallen angel at best, but he certainly did not have equal power to God. But Manichaeism, surfacing at this time, elevated the power of evil to a virtual equality with God. And so in the year 1208, a ferocious crusade was begun against the Manichaeans in southern France. And Pope Innocent III began inquisitions against those people. Then John Wycliffe, in the 14th century in England, began a translation of the Bible from Latin to English. And this was a threat to the Latin Bible of the Church, Keep in mind that the Roman Catholic Church had kept control over interpretation of the Scriptures. Very easy to do when it's in a foreign language to all Europeans. This was shaking up their control of the church. But Wycliffe went further. He went on to say that the Bible was a higher authority than the church, higher than papal authority. In 1380, the Pope declared John Wycliffe a heretic. His followers denied the value of confession, which was a central belief in the Roman Catholic Church. His followers were known as the Lollards, denied the doctrine of transubstantiation, that is, the literal changing of the wine and bread into the body and blood of Jesus, which was a cardinal central belief of Catholicism. They also denied the power of prayer for the dead, and they condemned war. They were pacifists. Not such a bad idea. But in a time of continual war and a time when the church was trying to raise warriors to go on the crusades to Jerusalem, this was a very unpopular idea to condemn war. So the Lollards were in severe conflict with the Roman Church. Then John Hus came along early in the 15th century, and he aimed severe criticism against the Roman Church. He opposed the sale of indulgences. He questioned the morality of the Pope. He even said the church should be under civil supervision. Well, thus you see, in just over 2 centuries, several attacks on the Roman Church were launched. And now, suddenly, the Roman Church felt severely threatened. Virtually every aspect of Roman doctrine and practice came under scrutiny and criticism, but all of it came down to one central thing: their supreme power was being challenged. Keep in mind that the Roman Church was the supreme power in Europe. All kings, even of rival nations, went to the Pope to solve problems. We talked about the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the world for the explorers between the Portuguese and the Spanish. The Pope was in a position of counselor and advisor to every European power, and thus he was a supreme power, and such power could only continue as long as the truth of the Roman Church was unchallenged. So the church struck back. First, in a mild way, by excommunication, but that turned out to be less powerful than the church imagined. The person who's excommunicated probably has already accepted that possibility and is prepared for it. And excommunication has a great deal of power by the insider. The person who's on the outside thinks of it as nothing particularly important. Second, they moved to Inquisition, to public examination. The leaders here the leader here was Dominic, later Saint Dominic, acting for the Roman Church. His followers became known through Europe as Dominicanes, the hounds of God. Then in 1417, during the reign of Henry IV, a statute was issued, De Heretico Comburendo, on the burning of heretics. And that more or less said, this is how you should deal with them. The final move came in 1484, when this man, Pope Innocent VIII, issued a papal bull called Summis Desiderantibus. Many, unmindful of their own salvation and straying from the Catholic faith, have abandoned themselves to incubi and succubi. Those are the sexual temptresses and tempters that we referred to earlier. And by their incantations, spells, conjurations, and other accursed charms and crafts have slain infants in the womb, also the offspring of cattle, have blasted the produce of the earth, the grapes of the vine, the fruits of trees, nay, men and women, herd animals, pasture land, corn, wheat, and all other cereals. So those who are against the church are here cast as enemies virtually of society, of agriculture, of animal husbandry, of people in general, and a whole list of things are attributed to them. And if you've read Cotton Mather, you know that some of these same kinds of charges come up in the trial of Martha Carrier. These wretches, the Pope went on to say, torment men and women, beasts of burden, herd beasts, as well as animals of other kinds, with terrible and piteous pains, both internal and external. They hinder men from performing the sexual act and women from conceiving. And, remember the biblical injunction, be fruitful and multiply. The Church, the Roman Catholic Church, always regarded the propagation of the species as important because they regard this as building the numbers of the Church. They blasphemously renounce the faith which is theirs by the sacrament of baptism, and at the instigation of the enemy of mankind, that is the devil, they do not shrink from committing and perpetrating the foulest abominations and filthiest excesses. The language is wonderful. It allows your imagination to run absolutely amok. But now here comes to the deadly peril of their own souls, whereby they outrage the divine majesty and are a cause of scandal and danger to very many. And here's the clincher. Therefore, we decree and enjoin that the inquisitors be empowered to proceed to the just correction, imprisonment, and punishment of any persons without let or hindrance. And in that papal bull, the Inquisition and 300 years of witch hunts was unleashed. Oh, the art is wonderful that comes out of this whole thing. Here's a woman being seduced, for instance, by someone who looks like just an ordinary man out in the fields, but if you look carefully, you'll see his feet are definitely devil's feet. You could see his devil's tail hanging down here. Almost immediately there appeared in print after this papal bull a work known as Malleus Maleficarum, which was written by two Dominicans. This title in Latin means the hammer of the witches. This book surveyed the whole history of demonology and witchcraft. It went to advocate Inquisition following the papal bull without let or hindrance. It also outlines strategies for the use of torture and lies. Thus was unleashed a vicious movement by the Roman Church to retain its power in a threatening environment of rebellion and criticism. A witch hunt that ultimately led to an estimated 200,000 imprisonments and executions. What came together here at this point in history was a long mythology of witchcraft that for centuries was regarded as relatively harmless, unthreatening sorcery. Secondly, a long mythology of demonology, also regarded as relatively harmless. Demons were simply bad spirits that you could tangle with if you got into bad places. If you were out in the water, your boat could be swamped. If you're out in the woods, you could run into these. If you were out late at night, you could run afoul of these sorts of things. But finally, what galvanized the whole thing was a desperate psychology from the Church determined to retain its power across Europe at any cost. Enemies of the Church were seen as witches, witches were seen as possessed by demons, and the Church was seen as an immense heroic institution rooting out evil in society, rooting out devotion to the devil, rooting out false religion, and anything that could possibly threaten the Holy Roman Empire. According to the Malleus Maleficarum, that is the Hammer of the Witches, which was published just shortly after this papal bull, with witches, Inquisition should use torture to extract confession. As torture was applied, the inquisitors should show regret and sympathy and unwillingness to do the task that they were doing. Someone should then come in and ask for the woman to be released. This is, in our terms, this is good cop, bad cop psychology. The inquisitor should then promise her her life if she will reveal the names of other witches. Of course, she will not escape with her life. But the judge can assuage his conscience by, at that point, discharging himself from the case and letting another judge take over, who can then carry through the conviction and the execution. Precautions were important for inquisitors. Women particularly must be stripped naked and searched. They must be shaved completely, because witches typically hide various charms and so on in their hair and in their clothing. And her body must be meticulously examined for telltale devil's marks, where the devil has suckled from the witch's body. And of course, any kind of birthmark or anything was of course going to make someone liable. The art clearly indicates, here's a woman, for instance, her body is, her clothes are being torn away. You can see here the humiliation. This was all part of the whole Inquisition process. Down here you can see someone who is heating up irons with the bellows in a fire, getting ready to torture. The instructions to the inquisitors actually read something like pornography, as horrible really as anything that has come out of the more recent Holocaust. So what about New England? What is, let me just put up one other picture here. This was a punishment that was done to witches. This is a brass cow, a fire lit under it, and here you can see that a condemned witch is being loaded into this brass cow to be heated inside. This was another form of torture and burning. So what about New England? What is clear is that the psychology of witchcraft and witch hunts passed right over the Reformation. What began as inquisitions in the Roman Church against people protesting Roman Catholic belief was picked up by Protestants after the Reformation, and in turn used against dissenters. Dissenters against the English Church were similarly threatened with witchcraft trials. So the very first Puritans experienced this kind of harassment. And in other words, the English Church picked up the methods from Rome of inquisition and trial and punishment, torture and execution. And the witchcraft trials that went on in England from about the time of Henry VIII, which would be in around the 1540s or 1550s, from then on, the witchcraft trials in England were not by the Roman Catholics, they were by the Church of England against dissenters. You see, the whole psychology is, this was a kind of a movable mythology that could be applied by either main branches of Christianity. This, in turn, crossed the Atlantic. Protesters who were at first victims of witchcraft became perpetrators. Puritans who were victims of Anglican Inquisition became themselves perpetrators of witch hunts. The fact is that the mythology of devils and demonology and witches was not specifically tied to the Roman Church. These things were outgrowths of an older European folklore picked up by the Church whenever it felt threatened. But they could equally be picked up by the Roman Church, the Anglican Church, or the Puritan Church. So what happened in Salem? Well, it began in the home of the Reverend Samuel Parris. His 9-year-old daughter, Elizabeth Parris, and her 11-year-old cousin, Abigail Williams. Elizabeth's father was a hellfire and damnation preacher. The household included Tituba, a West Indian servant, who entertained the girls with tales of magic and superstition. The girls experimented with fortune-telling. They're probably looking for knowledge of their future, knowledge of romance, marriage, the occupations of the future husbands, at least if we are to go by the reports of their lives that come out of this period. One of them devised a kind of crystal ball by dropping the white of an egg in a glass of water and watching the shapes. And of course, this is old-style sorcery. I mean, the Romans looked at chicken tracks in the sand, teacup reading, the throwing of straws in a circle to see the shapes that they take. These sorts of fortune-telling devices are much older than Christianity. These are very, very ancient. One of them, we aren't sure which of these two girls, but the students of this whole historical era suspected it was the 9-year-old. She suddenly saw in the egg white a coffin. This was a frightening omen of death, and their behavior immediately became strange, and they started to have fits and convulsions. Over a period of days, this spread to Anne Putnam, one of their friends, age 12, to Mary Walcott, age 16, to Elizabeth Hubbard, age 17, to Susan Sheldon and Elizabeth Booth, both age 18, to Mary Lewis, age 19, and to Mary Warren, age 20. On February 25th, 1692, the aunt of one of the girls asked Tituba to bake a witch's cake. This is part of the folklore of witchcraft. A cake that included the standard ingredients for a cake mixed with the urine of the affected girls. And this was fed to the family dog on the theory that witches have animal familiars who suckle on them. And if the dog acted a certain way, this would indicate that these girls were, in fact, witches. It worked. Suddenly, the girls were able to name those who had caused their possession. They named 3 women, the West Indian servant and 2 other women in the village. The 2 women were Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. From there, the whole thing escalated. The strange fits and convulsions continued. The accusations were made. More arrests occurred until finally, before the summer of 1692 was over, 185 people had been accused of witchcraft. 59 had been tried. 31 had been convicted. 19 executed. And a 20th pressed to death in an attempt to extract a confession. Now, it is clear that Cotton Mather interprets this whole business in traditional terms. He writes in The Wonders of the Invisible World. He was commissioned, actually, to write this immediately following the witchcraft trials. He and his father, Increase Mather, had both been involved, and both of them had written previously about witchcraft. And here is what Cotton Mather writes, interpreting this within the traditional framework of witchcraft, which, as we see, goes all the way back to that papal bull. The New Englanders are a people of God, settled in those which were once the devil's territories. And it may easily be supposed that the devil was exceedingly disturbed when he perceived such a people here accomplishing the promise of old made unto our blessed Jesus, that he should have the utmost parts of the earth for his possession. The devil, thus irritated, immediately tried all sorts of methods to overturn this poor plantation. Never were more satanical devices used. The devil is now making one attempt more on us. So his interpretation here is that this witchcraft outbreak is evidence that Satan is working to foul up this new kingdom, city on a hill that the Puritans are building in the New World. Now, of course, if you recall an earlier reading when we looked at Cotton Mather's Magnalia Christi Americana, the mighty works of Christ in America, he says something very similar to this in the beginning here too. He interprets the Christ as winning in America, but Satan as severely disturbed by it and doing everything that he can. First of all, he's had the Puritans persecuted in England, and now he's working as hard as he can to stop this going on in America. He goes on, we have now, with horror, seen the discovery of witchcraft. The army of devils is horribly broke in upon the place which is the center, and after a sort, the firstborn of our English settlements. Notice the mythology cropping up again, that this is the most important, the firstborn of English settlements in Massachusetts Bay. In historical fact, it's been preceded by Roanoke Island, by Jamestown, and by Plymouth. But you notice how the mythology works. Mather sort of covers over that and makes this the firstborn of English settlements. The houses of good people are filled with doleful shrieks of their children and servants, tormented by invisible hands, with tortures preternatural. More than 20 have confessed that they have signed unto a book which the devil showed them, and engaged in his hellish design of bewitching and ruining our land. It is a thing prodigious beyond the wonders of the former ages. The wonders of the invisible world, this is an edition of the book. You can see that it's of substantial length, running up to about 170 pages. The Martha Carrier trial that's in the anthology is one that is often anthologized because it's fairly dramatic, and it shows the full range of the kinds of charges that were brought against witches. But in fact, he wrote up all the trials in this particular work, and that this is a facsimile edition. It includes all kinds of woodcuts. Here, for instance, is Cotton Mather himself with his book and the devil. Here's another version, I think, of Cotton Mather confronting the devil. Here's a woodcut of a witch meeting out in the woods. Here's another one which shows witches dealing with what were known as animal familiars. Here we've got witches hovering in air, riding on broomsticks. We could see the origins of some ideas that have come all the way down to Halloween. Here we've got pictures of people handing over their babies to the devil. Here we've got pictures of witches burning babies. Here we've got an interesting woodcut that shows a woman saying, "Lord, have mercy upon me," but over her shoulder we can see here a demon whispering in her ear. And here's another woodcut of a confrontation with a devil. I'm not sure the placement of this is exactly right, but here's Cotton Mather himself. The trial of Martha Carrier, as I've said, is a good sample of the kind of thing that went on. This is August 2nd, 1692. Mather writes, "Martha Carrier was indicted for bewitching certain persons. During examination, the poor people were so tortured that everyone expected their death upon the very spot. But upon the binding of Carrier, they were," I think there's a word omitted there, "satisfied. But the look of Carrier then laid the afflicted people for dead." This idea of the evil eye, and the inquisitors and the people in the trial looked particularly for glances of witches upon people in the courtroom, and the way the people reacted was taken as evidence of whether or not they truly were witches. Of course, if you're frightened enough and somebody's in there being tried, of course, and she looks at you, I suppose you're going to have cold chills, and it's going to be evident. Several of her own children confessed not only that they were witches themselves, but that their mother had made them so. Benjamin Abbott gave his testimony that Carrier was very angry with him. Presently he was taken with a swelling in his foot, and then a pain in his side, a sore which was lanced by Dr. Prescott, and several gallons of corruption ran out of it. Then another sore bred in the groin, which was also lanced. Notice the vague sexual suggestion here of that. He was brought unto death's door, and so remained until Carrier was taken and carried away by the constable, from which very day he began to mend, and is well ever since. Of course, in freshman English classes we teach logic, and this is a common logical fallacy, which of course we often do fall into. After, therefore, because of. The conjunction of two things is easily mistaken for causality, and we can see here that the anger of Martha Carrier and then some kind of pain or sore is seen as being caused by her. But elementary logic, I think, reveals what's going on here. John Roger testified that upon the threatening words of this malicious Carrier, his cattle would be strangely bewitched. Samuel Preston testified that, having some difference with Martha Carrier, he lost a cow in a strange, preternatural, unusual manner. Phoebe Preston testified she heard a voice that she took to be Martha Carrier's. The voice told her she should within 2 or 3 days be poisoned. Accordingly, one half of her right hand became greatly swollen and very painful. She has had a great pain in her breast and legs. And one Foster, who confessed her own share in the witchcraft for which Carrier stood indicted, affirmed that she had seen the prisoner at some of their witch meetings and that it was this Carrier who persuaded her to be a witch. She confessed that the devil carried them on a pole to a witch meeting. What's interesting is that people who had already themselves confessed to witchcraft were nevertheless allowed to get up and testify against others. One Lacey, a confessed witch, testified that the prisoner was at the witch meeting in Salem village. Another Lacey, also a confessed witch, now testified that the prisoner was at the witch meeting in Salem village where they had bread and wine administered unto them. Well, that's enough to horrify a church official, I would think. Today, the behavior of these girls would be diagnosed in a number of ways. First, perhaps as childish play, the whole business of fortune telling, innocent childish play. Then, I suppose, an overact of imagination. The vision, for instance, of a coffin in an egg white. I mean, this is no different from looking up at a cloud and seeing the shape of an animal or a face or something, which can happen to anyone. But an overactive imagination, of course, can do wonders with this sort of thing. And probably their behavior of fits and convulsions would today be diagnosed as clinical hysteria. All of these today would be regarded as things correctable by some form of therapy. But in 17th century New England, the accusation of witchcraft moved the whole matter out of the field of medicine and moved it into the legal realm, which is to say someone was possessed, as these girls were, and thus a crime had been committed. They had been possessed. This was a crime, and the criminals had to be found out and punished. Well, how did all this come to an end? It ended as accusations spread. Demographically, convicted witches fit certain patterns. We know this, and let me just pause here to point out that there are lots of current works. For instance, this work, Salem Possessed, The Social Origins of Witchcraft, is an excellent little study available in paperback. Here's one that has a particularly feminist slant on it, The Devil in the Shape of a Woman, Witchcraft in Colonial New England. This one is an old standard, The Devil in Massachusetts. This was written back in the 40s. Here is another one that's very scholarly that contains numerous statistics and studies. Witchcraft, Magic, and Religion in 17th Century Massachusetts. And to put the witchcraft into a larger context, we have something like Worlds of Wonder, Days of Judgment, popular religious belief in early New England. It's perhaps reasonable and correct to say that this little this blip in history is probably being studied as much as any in American history. Those are just some of the works that have looked at it. How did it end? Well, as I say, demographically, the women who convicted witches fit certain patterns. 75% of them are women. About 25% are men. Typically, if it's women, they're over 40. Often, though not necessarily, single. Often they are women on the fringe of society. sometimes single women, sometimes widows, but certainly people are not in the mainstream family structure. You need to keep in mind that the family is absolutely central to Puritan society. And if we are to go by some of the things that were said, they often are an abrasive kind of person, women who are not well liked. The numerous accusations of harm by the accusers would suggest that these women, for some reason or other, were not very congenial with their neighbors. But these facts alone provide a kind of psychological explanation. Women were on the fringe of society, women who were offensive to the central citizens of the locality. But what brought the Salem witchcraft outbreak to a halt was the spread of accusations. Progressively, more and more people were accused, and the final straw that stopped it was when the governor's wife was accused. And one can be cynical here and say, well, once those in power are threatened, of course, they drop the charges. But the fact of the matter is the governor hadn't even been on Massachusetts soil when this whole thing broke out. In fact, that's why the jails filled up, because they were waiting for him to arrive to begin the trials. His wife wasn't even there. So there had been a lot of talk for a long time about evidence and about due process, but this was what finally brought it to a halt, and it was shut down very, very quickly. Well, as I say, there are numerous analyses. There are economic reasons that we can attribute to this, the jealousy on the part of economically disadvantaged, perhaps against those who are more advantaged. Conflicts in Salem. There's been a lot of study of conflicts in the generation preceding in Salem. Others have pointed to lots of crises that had developed in that part of the world. Feminists, of course, point to the preponderance of women and see a repression of women. But I think that we need to keep in mind that something else is going on here. The first accusations, the first confessions were very bumbling. These people were not used to being confronted in this way, but as the confessions developed, they became more and more enhanced. Each person that confessed used material from the previous confessions, and these things began to take on a very daring and dramatic format. What I think was happening is a kind of oral literature was being created under pressure right before the eyes in these courts. These people were once again under pressure of death, coming up with imaginative stories to account for themselves, because it was clear that only if one confessed could one get free. Those who did not confess were over and over again executed. And so we have another form of literature, literature created under duress. Well, have a good day.